Episode 6. Welcome to this episode of the Canada History Society's series on British Columbia and Confederation with Canada. In this, the 6th episode of the Canada History Society's 20-part series, we look at the beginnings of Canada, Confederation. In the year 1867, the world turned quietly but profoundly. In Germany, Prussia stitched together 22 northern states into a federation that would one day give rise to the German Empire. In Japan, an emperor emerged from behind the silken screens of Kyoto to launch the Meiji Restoration, setting fire to the old feudal order and forging the engines of industry. And in the northeast corner of North America, among the forests and frost of some of Britain's remaining continental colonies, something quietly radical occurred. 4 British colonies, sparsely populated, militarized, and with no revolution to animate them, decided to forge a nation. It was, in the words of historian Peter Waite, a miracle of moderation. There was no battlefield, no Jacobin fervor, no thunderous declarations of liberty or death, only deliberation, compromise, and calculation. Confederation, John A. Macdonald wrote to Governor-General Lord Monck on June 26, 1866, will be an event which will make us historical. Not with my will would another person take my place. It was not a birth in fire, but it was, unmistakably, a birth. The process began with paralysis. By the 1860s, the Union of the Canadas, Upper and Lower, English and French, was collapsing beneath its own contradictions. Governed jointly since 1841, the province had become a political quagmire, a legislative system locked in endless stalemate. In historian Donald Creighton's words, it was a partnership sustained less by unity than by exhaustion. Each bill, each budget, each motion became a trial by combat until all parties began to see that the existing structure was not merely flawed, it was doomed. But it was not only domestic dysfunction that drove men to envision a new nation. Across the southern border, the United States had torn itself apart in civil war, and when the guns finally fell silent in 1865, they were replaced by an ideology no less aggressive, manifest destiny, the belief that America's expansion across the continent was both justified and inevitable took on a new energy. The Fenians, Irish-American veterans of the Union Army, began raiding across the Canadian borders. The U.S. purchased Alaska in 1867, pushing its reach northward. In Ottawa and Halifax, in Fredericton and Quebec, the message was clear. If the colonies did not hang together, they might be picked off, one by one. The British, watching from across the Atlantic, had their own interests. The American Civil War had nearly entangled Britain in global catastrophic war. In London, the Foreign Office saw their North American holdings not as imperial jewels, but as diplomatic liabilities. As Barry Goff notes, Britain's disengaged attitude was based upon the idea that colonies should be self-sufficient and self-sustaining, not a millstone around our necks. They were expensive to defend, increasingly self-sufficient, and worse yet, potential flashpoints with Washington. The age of colonial management, writes historian Jed Martin, was giving way to the age of colonial autonomy. Encouraged by Downing Street, colonial governors were quietly instructed to foster cooperation and prepare the ground for union.
There were 2 problems that still remained. One of them was the Hudson Bay Company's ownership of Hudson Bay, and the other thing was who was going to pay for all of that. The preliminary Confederation achievement had been acquired when the United Provinces of the Canadas was established, whereby Lower Canada or Quebec and Upper Canada, Ontario, forged the new union. And Sir John A. Macdonald had been part and parcel of that arrangement. But there was a question also of the maritime provinces, including Newfoundland, Labrador, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. And these leaders, looking for a new solution for their own unity and purposes that they would share in common. They weren't talking about having one province, they were talking about an association themselves. And they met in Charlottetown, which we call the cradle of Confederation, in the summer of 1864 to talk about the various possibilities of an alliance of British North American provinces that would be to the east of the United Provinces of Canada. The wise people in Upper Canada and Lower Canada, thinking about this, decided to hire a steamer and go down to Prince Edward Island to inviting themselves to this meeting. And they arrived with champagne and scotch and a few other jollities. And it was an invitation that wasn't extended, but they were very welcome when they got there. And out of this comes the Charlottetown Agreement to continue the discussions, which is, as we know, is a very Canadian thing, continue the discussions. And it was therefore that in Quebec, in the fall 1864, that resolutions were developed by this enlarged group of people representing all these various parts of the future Dominion of Canada that put together 72 resolutions. Now, this is only a shopping list of what they wanted. By no means was it a legal document, but it had been a great step forward. And as I like to think of it, it was forged at a time of great crisis in North America, a great crisis in Anglo-American relations as well, because the Trent crisis and the problems that were attendant on the cruising ships of the Confederacy, all of these were very, very big difficulties. Thus, we were, in a time of crisis, developed the scheme for a Canadian Confederation. Much remained to be done. The legal matters had to be addressed in London, but the torch had been lit for the idea of a future Canadian Confederation.
Into this fraught landscape stepped two men, John A. Macdonald and George-Étienne Cartier. Macdonald, the whiskey-dry Scottish lawyer from Kingston, understood better than anyone the need for a strong central government. Cartier, proud French-Canadian and former patriotic rebel, believed in federalism as the only way to protect Quebec's language and religion. They were an improbable duo, but together they crafted a vision not of rebellion, but of resolution. Let us, Macdonald declared, form one people with one destiny. The journey passed through three great conferences. First, Charlottetown in 1864, where the Canadians wrangled an invitation to a maritime union meeting and brought with them not only grand proposals, but grander hospitality. In the words of historian Richard Gwynn, it was not the arguments that persuaded the Maritimers, it was the brandy. Then Quebec City, where the 72 resolutions laid the groundwork for a new federal system. And finally, London, where Queen Victoria's ministers reviewed, amended, and passed the British North American Act. On July 1st, 1867, the Act came into effect. Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia became the Dominion of Canada, a self-governing nation within the British Empire. We are not building a republic, Macdonald insisted. We are founding a nation. The new country would retain the crown, the Westminster system, and ties to London, but in all things domestic, it would govern itself. And govern it did. Confederation, though incomplete, set in motion the machinery of expansion. Within 5 years, Manitoba and British Columbia would join. Within 18 years, the Canadian Pacific Railway would stretch a steel ribbon from the St. Lawrence to the Pacific. The Federation would grow, adapt, and sometimes falter, but it would endure. In the words of W.L. Morton, Canada was not created in a moment of glory, nor in a spasm of revolution. It was made by men who understood that history is made not only by vision, but by patience. This was the genius of Confederation. It was not dramatic. It was not even inevitable, but it was in the end enduring. And so it began, not with the roar of cannon, but with the scratch of pens on parchment, a new nation, a different America, a Canada. Join us next time for Part 7 of the Canada History Society's 20-part series as we explore 3 options for British Columbia. The choice.